Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to this next episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. My name is Daniel Cantey, and in this episode we're going to be returning to the biblical narrative from our short break where we took a couple of episodes and talked about the meaning of the modern world and how we interpret certain experiences in the modern world through the lens of principles that we see in the Old Testament, especially principles that we see in the Exodus. So having taken that short break, we're now going to return to the biblical narrative, which is the larger narrative for us of the creation of Israel. The big question here is, how is it that God creates? How is it that he makes his people and puts them in the land that he has designated for them? Remember, for God, when he creates things, those things have a place. And so Israel is being created, and it is on the way to its place, on the way to the promised land. Now, I want to say about the Exodus here that when we think of it generally, and when it has been thought of historically, it's thought of as a release from Egypt. And that's clear enough why that is the case. The people are enslaved there, but not only enslaved, they're ruthlessly oppressed, they're tyrannized by violence, and they are liberated from that slavery and from that oppression. But the story of liberation is not the whole story. Because when we put the Exodus in the context of the broader story of the creation of Israel, we see that there is a transition here. They're not being freed from one law for the sake of just being free. They are being freed from one law so that they can come under another. They're being freed from the law of Pharaoh so that they can come under the law of God. And so what we see very shortly in the story after the Exodus is the movement to Sinai. That's the first place that they go. And so when we think about what the Exodus is, it's really a break or a moment between two laws. And in the broader sense here, that makes it a moment of rest. Because rest is always embedded within the law. Rest is embedded within work. These two categories are complementary. These two ideas work together. So to think of what the Exodus, in fact, accomplishes is not just freedom on its own, but a freedom that looks forward to being obedient again, to having a God, a king, to having a Lord and ruler who gives a law, in this case, a law that is merciful. And so do we have freedom? Well, yes, of course we have freedom. But inasmuch as we are between two laws, we have a moment of rest. And so it's good to be thinking about the Exodus that way, not only as a moment of liberation, but as a moment that looks forward to God establishing himself as the Israelites' God, as their new lawgiver, as it were. And we're going to come to the Ten Commandments here pretty shortly. That's going to be much of our focus for this particular episode. So we're going to begin, however, with the story of the manna given in the desert. This is Exodus chapter 16. And I'm going to read some part of the chapter and then come back and make some comments on it. And we're going to have the fathers speak to us for part of this as well. So starting with chapter 16, verse 2. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. The children of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died, smitten by the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate bread to the full. For you brought us out into this desert to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread out of heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. So it shall be on the 6th day, they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." And what's actually given to the Israelites is meat in the evening, that's quail, and bread in the morning, which is the manna. But continuing on with the story here, verse 8. Moses said to the children of Israel, "The Lord's glory shall be seen when he gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints you make against him. But what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against God. Verse 13, so it was that quail came up at the evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. But when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the desert was a small round substance, white like coriander seed, like frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is this? For they did not know what it was. Thus Moses said to them, this is the bread the Lord gives you to eat. This is what the Lord has ordered. Let every man gather it for his family, 1 omer according to the head count and number of souls among you. Each one should gather it with those who share your tents. Then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Each one gathered according to the need of those sharing the tent with him. Moses then said, let no one leave any of it till morning. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. So Moses was angry with them. Thus they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need, and when the sun became hot, it melted. So it was on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, this is the word the Lord has spoken. Tomorrow is the Sabbath, a holy rest to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded them, but it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Moses then said, eat that today, for tomorrow is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? Behold, for the Lord has given you this day as the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his house. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Thus the people rested on the 7th day. I'm going to stop with the passage there and point out a handful of different things about it. So the first thing to note here is that the manna is a type of Christ. If you look at John chapter 6, Christ says, I am the bread from heaven. He is the true bread that if one eats of it, he does not die. And I'm paraphrasing the Christ here. Your ancestors ate the manna in the desert and they died. But he who eats this bread from heaven will not die. And this bread is given equally. And at this point, we're going to let St. Cyprian of Carthage speak to us about the equality of the gift that is given. St. Cyprian says, nay, rather, the Holy Spirit is not given from a measure, but is poured out completely upon the believer. For if the day is born to all equally, and if the sun shines upon all with equal and similar light, how much more does Christ, the sun and true day, bestow equally in his church the light of eternal life with equal measure? We see that the pledge of this equality is celebrated in Exodus, when the manna fell from heaven and, with a prefiguring of the future, showed the nourishment of heavenly bread and the food of the coming Christ. For there, without distinction of either sex or age, a measure was collected for each equally. End quote. So the emphasis here is on God's distribution, and that distribution being equal to all. Those who had need of much had much. Those who had need of little had little. Now, in our fallen world that we live in, this kind of distribution is achieved through charity. And it's critical that we understand this. From the biblical perspective, those who have much tend to have excess, and those who have little tend to have lack, which is not enough for what they actually need. And the way that this inequality is remedied is by charity, by love. This is the only way that the Bible teaches us, that I am aware of how this discrepancy is to be overcome. In the modern world, in the last 100 or 200 years, we have these political systems that try to establish an equal distribution for everybody. That's not the biblical way. The biblical way of overcoming the inequalities and the large discrepancies that sometimes exist in our world as fallen is, again, by love, by charity, by the giving of those who have in excess to those who have little and are therefore in want. It's really quite interesting to think about this, in fact, in terms of the salvation that we saw in Joseph and in the story of Joseph, when there are 7 years of plenty, that is, years of excess and great abundance, followed by 7 years of famine, 7 years of utter depravity and want and loss. Well, what does one do to remedy that kind of discrepancy? Well, you take from what is in excess and you save it for the years of want and the years of famine, so that the excess is reduced and the famine is mitigated. The amount of loss and the amount of poverty that's there in the years of famine is not as bad as it would be, because some of the excess of the first 7 years fills the gap, as it were. And so when we think about God's measure, God's distribution, it is an equal distribution given to all. As we are told, the Holy Spirit is given to all, and here this manna is given to all in equal measure. But in light of our fallenness, we are trying to recreate in our action and our love for one another that kind of equal distribution. But that equal distribution happens through the humility of those who have more than they need to be able to give, and the humility of those who don't have what they need to be able to receive. And so there is humility all around as people love one another and as people find rest in one another. Moving on here, there's another quote talking about the lack of excess. In particular, this is from St. John Chrysostom. Let's hear what he has to say. Quote, "If anyone cannot endure what I have said, but still clings to the poverty of worldly things, snatching at the things which undergo diminution, let him call to mind the food of manna. Let him tremble at the example of that punishment. For what happened in that instance, this same result one may now also see in the case of covetous people. But what happened then to them? Worms were bred from their covetousness. This also now happens in their case. For the measure of the food is the same for all. You have but one stomach to fill. Only you who feed luxuriously have more to get rid of. Those who gathered in their houses more than the lawful quantity gathered not manna, but more worms and rottenness. Just so both in luxury and in covetousness, the gluttonous and drunken gather not more delicacies, but more corruption." And so the emphasis of St. John for us here is a recognition that to gather more than what one needs, to gather in excess while others are in want, is in fact to gather corruption to oneself. Just as those in ancient Israel who gathered more manna than they needed and had it last until the day after the day that it was given, saw that it stank and that it had worms growing out of it. St. John of Kronstadt adds something I think of great interest to us when it comes to the Lord's Prayer. When we think about this story of manna and of the manna from heaven and of receiving what one needs for the day. Here's what St. John of Kronstadt says, quote, "Love with all your might that which is spiritual and heavenly, and despise that which is material, earthly. Remember the words of your Savior. Give us this day our daily bread. Only this day. The highest Christian wisdom lies concealed in these words." And so when we think about the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, only this day, says St. John of Kronstadt, this is the pattern that we see in God's giving of the manna to the Israelites. Each day, he gives them their daily bread, only for that day. And so when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we should be thinking to ourselves, give us this day our daily bread. Dear Lord, give me what I need for this day and this day only. I suspect that for many of us, as we walk through the world and as we encounter its various temptations, that we want more than what we need for this day. Now, let's be honest with ourselves. Some of us are a little greedy, and we want to trust in money, or we want to trust in worldly things. And so when we pray, give us this day our daily bread, what we are feeling is give me at least enough for this day. Give me enough for this week or this month or this year. Give that all to me now so that I can take some solace in it. But the Lord's Prayer and the wisdom, the great Christian wisdom that lies in this, according to St. John, is to ask for only what one needs for the day. To trust in God day by day, period by period, interval by interval, that He will continue to give, so that our trust is appropriately located in Him and not in what He has given. That our focus relies on the giver, not on the gift that has been received. There is such humility in this. And I think it's important to think that there is this Old Testament example of how the manna was given. And Christ gives us, echoes for us, this Old Testament example in the prayer that He taught His disciples, and by extension, of course, taught anyone who wishes to be His disciple and teaches all of us. Give us this day our daily bread. As manna was given in the desert to the Israelites daily, so give us for the day what it is that we require. Now, the last point I want to make on this story has to do with the Sabbath at the end. This is chapter 16, verse 29. Let every man remain in his house on the Sabbath. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. Thus the people rested on the seventh day. So the people don't need to gather the manna on the seventh day because they get twice as much on the sixth day. But importantly, the text says, let no man go out of his place. Thus the people rested. And here what we see is another instance of what it means to rest. To rest means to be in one's place. We saw this earlier in chapter 1 of Genesis, that for things to be good means that they are at rest in their place. We see it again here. To be at rest is to be where one is assigned to be, or rather where in that place that God has given for one to be. And so if you are at rest, you are at rest in your place. Just a theme that we've seen along the way in a few different points. So, moving on from that story, we're going to come to the Ten Commandments. Now, chapter 19 of Exodus, Israel arrives as a people at Sinai. They are told that if they obey the Lord's voice, they will be a royal priesthood and a holy nation. Boundaries are placed around the mountain. No one is allowed to touch the mountain, and they shall die if they do, with the notable exception of Moses. And Israel has to prepare for God to descend and be present among them on the mountain. Moses sanctifies them, meaning that they wash their clothes. The men don't go near their wives in preparation for the third day, because what God is coming to do is something holy. He is coming to be present among them. The Ten Commandments are to be given. Now, what does this mean, this giving of the Ten Commandments, this giving of the law? Well, I want to think about it just a little more abstractly than we might normally think of it, and that is that God is forming His people. It is law that gives a particular people their form, their way of being. The law is going to describe Israel's relationship to God, who is at the heart of their being as a people. They are this people as they are under this God. This God and His way will define them as His. This is what makes them a royal priesthood and a holy nation, that they belong to Him and they are set apart. They are made specific. They are made distinct. They are giving a concrete boundary, as it were, by their relationship to this God. The law gives them form, that their way of being shall be His and under Him. Now, I want to think about it, again, a little bit more in the abstract. Everything has a law that gives it definition. So a tree has a law. That law says that it has a trunk and that it has roots that go in the ground and that it has leaves. At the same time, an elephant has a law that defines it as an elephant. So it's got large ears and it's got a long trunk, and generally they weigh quite a bit, several hundred pounds, if not more, and they make particular kinds of sounds. And so because these things have a definition, which is to say they have a law that defines them, we can point at a tree and say that's a tree. And we can point at an elephant and say that's an elephant. And we don't get them confused, or at least we're not supposed to. So we don't get them confused. In a similar way, you could point to this people and say, this people has a form. It is defined by its relationship to this God, which in practice means the law, and in conjunction with the law, which we'll talk about in the next few episodes, is the sacrifices. We'll spend a little bit more time on that coming up here when we get to Leviticus. But it is these that give the people definition, that makes them what they are. Now, the Ten Commandments, starting in chapter 20, how exactly are we to look at them? What are we to think of them? So let's hear from St. Caesarius of Arles. He's going to introduce us to them. He says, quote, "We should also know that the 10 commandments of the law are also fulfilled by the 2 gospel precepts, love of God and love of neighbor. For the initial commandments, the first few, which were written on the first tablet, pertain to the love of God, while the second tablet commandments were inscribed, one of which is honor your father and mother. Doubtless all of the latter are recognized as pertaining to love of neighbor. The Lord said in the gospel, on these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. Likewise, we read what the Apostle James said, but whoever offends in one point has become guilty in all. What does it mean to offend in one point and lose all, except to have fallen from the precept of charity, and so to have offended in all the other commands?" So love of God and love of neighbor. That's what we have here. But realistically, when we look at these commandments, when you look at the 10 commandments, people think immediately of thou shalt nots. You shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. These are the things that tend to come to mind. Let's see what St. Paul says. This is chapter 13, verse 8 of his epistle to the Romans. He says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." End quote. So not only St. Caesarius, but also St. Paul says to us, well, love is the fulfillment of these thou shalt nots. But what exactly is love? What does it mean for us to love another? Well, we've already seen this when we look at Genesis chapter 2 and the relationship between Adam and Eve. Remember, Adam's burdens are too much for him, and so Eve is given to him. Why is Eve given to him, if not to help him bear those burdens? In other words, to give him rest from his burdens. Now, Galatians 6:2 says this explicitly, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." So to love another person is to bear their burdens. In other words, it is to give them rest. That is the larger part of love. Another part of love, which is implied in the coexistence of people, in Adam's existence for Eve and Eve's existence for Adam, is that they are laws to one another. That if you look at another person and you see the image of God, then you are to love God in that person. That is an obligation, a work that is incumbent upon you. In the same way that God says, be fruitful and multiply. God says, till the ground and keep it. And so in these manners that God has given us, we are to create after his fashion, in the way that he instructs us. And so again, there are these commands, these obligations that are implicit in our coexistence with one another. And so we give one another rest, and at the same time, there is a joint task for us, with a greater burden here, I think, on the giving of rest, because Eve is there to lessen Adam's burden. And so these 10 commandments, if they are about love of God and neighbor, They are about finding rest in God and about giving rest to the neighbor. And what I'm going to do here is read through the Ten Commandments. We're going to go through them, and I'm going to look at them from the angle of rest and where it is that we see rest at work, how it is that we see rest at work. Because the giving of rest to others, remember, is to love. And we are told by St. Paul that love is the summation of the law. So let's begin here. First with the preamble. God says in chapter 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And let's remember here what this means. What this means is, I am the one who brought you out from under a law where there was no rest. I am the one who brought you out of ruthless oppression. I am the one who brought you out from under the Pharaoh, the one who would tyrannize you by violence. I am the one who brought you out of slavery and out of the ruthless oppression of that slavery in Egypt. And then the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, what this means directly, God is saying that we shall worship and exalt only him. That Israel is to believe only in him. Israel is to seek only him. Israel is to make sacrifices only to him. This is understood, you shall have no other gods before me, to mean monotheistically, you shall have no other gods with me. The relationship between God and Israel is one of husband and wife, and we see this at times in the prophets, especially the prophet Hosea. But if you are in a marriage relationship, there is no other in that relationship. To have a third party in that relationship is automatically for one spouse to put that third party above the other spouse. Because the relationship of marriage means one and one, husband and wife. There is to be no other, no third. That third, by their mere presence, gets between the two who are meant for each other. So you shall have no other gods before me means you shall have no other gods at all. God says you are to look, O Israel, only to him. And for our purposes, what this means is Israel shall rest only in God alone, in God and no other. He is the beginning and their end and the end of their rest. The next commandment, you shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, recompensing the sins of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me, and keep my commandments. Now, the emphasis here is not on having images. Clearly, in the Orthodox Church, we have images. In the Old Testament temple, when it was built, in Solomon's temple, there were images. The point is on not bowing down to them or serving them. That is at issue. And what's important here is the lesson of keeping the lesser in the lesser place and the greater in the greater place, not confusing the greater and the lesser. Now, God will say then, there can be images in the temple, but you are not to worship or bow down to those images. You shall not worship or bow down created things rather than the Creator. And this idea of not confusing greater and lesser shows up in other places in the New Testament. I would call it a consistent principle in places in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. I think it's actually perhaps more visible there than in the Old Testament at times. So, for example, if you go to Matthew 23, several of Jesus's criticisms of the Pharisees have to do with them confusing the greater and the lesser. And here what we see is an Old Testament foundation for that. You shall not bow down and worship what is lesser, but you will maintain its place as lesser. You will bow down and worship what is greater, that is, the Creator, God alone, and shall not confuse these two. You shall rest in God alone, rest in the Creator, and not rest in what He has created. The next commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And here again, you are to honor God. You are to show him all respect and exalt him. and his name is to be holy. The next commandment, here we come to the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son, nor your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor your stranger who sojourns with you. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And here we're going to learn a little bit from St. Augustine. He has a couple of quotes for us about this particular commandment. So the first, St. Augustine says, "To teach a Christian anything about the observance of the Sabbath would seem to be rather superfluous. On the contrary, not only is it not superfluous, but it is in fact basic bedrock doctrine, because it is a shadow of things to come. The people you see are forbidden to perform servile works on the Sabbath. Now are we, I ask you, not forbidden to perform servile works? Listen to the Lord. Everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. And yet to celebrate the Sabbath is to hope to receive from God this very thing of not committing sin. That's why it's written, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. God rested. God enables you to rest." And our rest here, to make it clear for St. Augustine, is rest from sin, from what he calls servile works, that we are able to set ourselves apart from those things that would corrupt us because of the rest given on the Sabbath, a rest that is modeled after God's own rest and which he gives to us. Another quote from St. Augustine. "The commandment is, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. This commandment imposes a regular periodical holiday, quietness of heart, tranquility of mind, the product of a good conscience. Here is sanctification, because here is the Spirit of God. Well, here is what a true holiday, that is to say, quietness and rest, means. Upon whom, he says, shall my spirit rest? Upon one who is humble and quiet and trembles at my words. So unquiet people are those who recoil from the Holy Spirit, loving quarrels, spreading slanders, keener on argument than on truth. And so in their restlessness, they do not allow the quietness of the spiritual Sabbath to enter into themselves." End quote. And so St. Augustine here reminds us of the character of the day and the kind of experience of rest we are meant to have, which is to say, tranquility of mind, quietness of heart, the product of a good conscience. Here is sanctification. Here is the Spirit of God. So when we come to worship, we come to experience the Spirit of God. And on the day that he has given us for rest, we seek quietness of heart. We seek tranquility of mind. This is what we should be trying to achieve in ourselves, striving for in ourselves. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this fourth commandment because it is really intriguing to me. The first part of the commandment is that we are to rest. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. So here, quite clearly, we are to rest in God. There is a point where our labors stop, where our work ceases, and where we are to rest. This is the commandment. And so in this particular day, we rest in God's provision, as the Israelites rested, for example, on the Sabbath, not going out and collecting manna, but having received 2 days' worth on the sixth day, so that on the seventh they don't have to collect it. But in this case, it's not only us, we who are resting. It's not just us. The commandment has to do with others. Neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor your stranger who sojourns with you. So in other words, if you are the man of the house, or arguably as well the woman of the house receiving this commandment, there are those who are in your sphere of authority and care, those who are under you, as it were. Your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, the stranger who sojourns with you. None of them shall work. And so the commandment that is upon you is first that you shall rest, and you shall rest in God's provision. The second part of this is that you shall ensure that others who are under you also rest. You will not permit them to work. They shall have what is holy. And what we see here is a kind of floor, a kind of minimum, if you will, the bottom rung on the ladder of what it means to love others. Because by doing this, you're not necessarily going out and removing their burdens from them, but yet you are giving them rest from their burdens, particularly as labor is concerned as a burden. They shall have rest from their burdens on this day. And you, if you are in this particular position, will ensure that they have it. And so the principle is laid down: you shall give your neighbor, and those who are weaker than you, those who are at a lower position socially than you, you shall make sure that they have rest from their burdens. They shall have a space where those burdens are not imposed upon them. The stranger who is with you, who is vulnerable to you, who is sojourning with you, he or she shall have rest. You shall provide this for them. Their burdens shall not weigh on them on this day. Your male servant and female servant, if you have a slave, they shall rest. You shall not abuse or exploit or tyrannize the servant who is under you, and give them no rest on this day. You shall lighten their burdens. They shall not have to bear those burdens on this day. Your son and your daughter who obey you, they shall rest on this day, and what burdens they bear, they shall not bear on this day. And so the heaviness that they feel, whatever those burdens may be on the other days of the week, that heaviness will be lightened. And your role is to be the one who ensures that it is so lightened. And so what we see here is both rest in God and provision of rest for the neighbor, particularly the neighbor who is under your authority, the neighbor who is in some sense subject to you, including even your animals. The cattle shall rest. It bears a burden. It helps you with all that you have to do in the field. It also shall rest. So all of these lower things receive their rest as you are the one who rests in God. And so there is trust in God. There is security in God. There is seeking God, obedience to God. At the same time that there is love of neighbor. And it's really interesting to think, when we think about the teachings of the prophets, how over and over again there are two major sins: idolatry and oppression. And oppression is putting burdens on the lowest of society, exploiting them, harming the poor. And here what we have is that one will not exploit, but one will give rest. One will not tyrannize by violence, but one will give rest. All people in a given household, to include the animals, shall have a share in what is holy. All of them shall have rest. And in this way, they shall love one another. Those who are at the top of this particular household will ensure that burdens do not overcome those in their household. And in this way, all of those in the household shall be loved. All of them shall have their burdens lightened. There will be no oppression here. The next commandment says, "Honor your father and mother, that it may be well with you, and your days may be long upon the good land the Lord your God is giving you." So in other words, again, honor your father and mother, exalt them, hold them high, give them respect. Don't dismiss them, don't insult them, don't harm them. I would say by extension, honor what it is that your father and mother give to you. If you are in Israel, your father and mother give to you the memory of what God has done for the people. They are the patrimony that God has given to you. And by honoring your father and mother, you honor that patrimony. You honor your place in being a member of the people of God. And if you honor that place in ancient Israel, unsurprisingly enough, your days are long in the good land that the Lord your God is giving you, which is to say, the physical place that you are to receive as a member of the people of Israel. And here, as Christians, we look at this particular passage and we honor our fathers and mothers who are biologically our parents. I would add that we should honor our spiritual fathers and mothers, the saints who are before us, those who have strengthened and nourished the church over the centuries, those who have given us a kind of spiritual blessing, that we should remember them, that our place in the church by their prayers may be secured. But we rest not only in God, but in what God has given for the place that we are supposed to have. The next few commandments: you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. If we are to interpret these through the lens of rest, then we move a little bit away from the idea of labor, which we see in particular in the fourth commandment, to the idea of, in general, of what it means to bear a burden. So, you shall not burden another by taking his life. That is, by murder. And we've seen already when we talked about Genesis 4 that murder is a broader category in the Old Testament than simply the immediate taking of life, with a knife or a pistol or something along those lines these days. But to take life in general can mean to murder, to absorb the life that another should have and use it for yourself. To commit adultery, most certainly to impose a burden on others, to impose anxiety and hardship, misery and anguish on the one who has to suffer this infidelity. You shall not steal. You shall allow a person peace and rest in what God has given them. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Your neighbor shall be able to rest in you by means of trust. It's really interesting to think about our society today and how people do not trust one another. This is another way of saying biblically that they do not rest in one another. Although I think it's a really interesting question that I can't answer here, whether people don't trust in one another because they don't have sufficient conditions for rest in one another, or whether they don't rest in one another because they don't trust in one another. Which one is primary? Which one comes first? My thought on this is that people don't trust one another because they don't have the conditions for resting in one another, that they are so spread apart that they don't really have a way of life that's conducive to trusting in one another. People don't trust strangers. But in any case, in all of these, we see a kind of floor for burdens that you shall not impose on your neighbor, for rest that you shall give to your neighbor. You shall not take their life. You shall not cause them excessive burdens or anguish. You shall not take from them what God has given to them. Now, just to remind us that these texts can be read in a different way, we're going to look at what St. John Cassian says about the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Although he's writing on Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, he doesn't say adultery, he says fornication. So we should note that. But here is what he says on the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. It is written in the law, you shall not commit fornication. This is required in a beneficial way according to the simple sound of the letter by the person who is still entangled in the passions of fleshly impurity. It is necessarily observed in spiritual fashion, however, and here he's going to give us a spiritual interpretation of the commandment. It is necessarily observed in spiritual fashion by one who has already left behind this filthy physical behavior and impure disposition, so that he also rejects not only all idolatrous ceremonies, but also every superstition of the Gentiles and the observance of auguries and omens and of all signs and days and times. And he is certainly not engaged in the divination of particular words or names, which befouls the wholesomeness of our faith." End quote. And so here, what St. John Cassian does is remind us that these passages as well, we've been looking at them through the lens of rest between people. They can also be interpreted spiritually. And how do you commit adultery spiritually? How do you fornicate spiritually? Well, it's by going to idolatrous ceremonies and believing in superstitions, looking into auguries and omens and consulting them. So there is also that particular interpretation. Again, another way of not resting in God. And so here, the commandment to be able to be faithful, to have fidelity, and in this way to provide rest for your spouse, that your spouse can rest in you, this is applied rather to the spiritual relationship, to maintain your fidelity, to maintain your faithfulness towards God. In this case, reminding you that it is your duty to rest in God alone. Now, the last commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his house, neither shall you covet his field, nor his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, any of his cattle, or whatever belongs to your neighbor. So the commandment to covet is essentially to say, you shall rest in what God has given you. You shall rest in your wife, not your neighbor's, and in your house, not your neighbor's. Neither shall you covet your neighbor's field, nor his male servant. Whatever it is that God has given you, you take solace and have gratitude for what he has given you, and not seek to have what belongs to others. Covetousness is arguably the most inward of these last few commandments. Arguably, it precedes them because it has to do with the condition of the heart and one's level of satisfaction and thanksgiving for what God has given in what one has. If you are satisfied with your own wife and you are thankful to God for her, you're probably not going to be inclined to go and try to take another man's wife. If you are satisfied in your fields and in your house and in your belongings, then you're going to be much less inclined to think about stealing from another man, from your neighbor. And so guard your mind, guard your heart. Do not covet. Rest in what God has given you, primarily because he is the giver, but secondarily because his gifts are good. Now, having looked at the Ten Commandments, it's worth seeing again more broadly that these are about love. They are about loving God and loving neighbor. They are about resting in God and giving rest to the neighbor. That we see them at work, both in the initial commandments that are oriented towards our Father, towards our Lord, and also in the second set of commandments that follow that have to do with how we are to bear our neighbor's burdens, or conversely here, make sure that we don't impose burdens on our neighbor, that we give them rest in us, that we are the kind of people that they can trust and with whom they can have fellowship, and who ideally will guide them and strengthen them in their own pursuit of the presence of our Father. I would add as well that as we think about love and we think about the giving of rest, that we should remember here that God is forming his people. He says to them, these things you shall do, these things you shall not do. And these 10 commandments form the bedrock. They make up the bedrock of that formation. God is creating his people. And he creates them by saying, you shall live in these ways. This you shall do, this you shall not do. And so he forms them, he gives them shape and definition as his own. Now, in the next few chapters, which are referred to as the Book of the Covenant, there are several different kinds of commandments. I'm just going to go over a few for sake of time here. There's really only a few things that I can cover. So the first thing that I want to cover is the attitude of the Book of the Covenant towards slavery. So there's a few different commands here. Chapter 21, verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his lord gave him a wife, and she bore him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her lord's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my lord, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his lord shall bring him to the judgment seat of God, and also to the door or to the doorpost, and his lord shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. And what I want to emphasize here is that, strictly speaking, there is to be no slavery among Israelites. In our day, in contemporary America, we would call this indentured servitude. So it's 6 years, and the 7th year, you go free. So you're a slave, but only for a time. And if you wish to remain a slave, then you may do so. You have the freedom to do this. Chapter 21, verse 17, here in the Septuagint. Whoever kidnaps one of the children of Israel and overcomes and sells him, and he is found with him, let him surely die. So in other words, if you take another Israelite and you intend to sell that Israelite as a slave and you are caught in the act, the penalty is death. So slavery is seen quite seriously. It is not something that is condoned positively in the Bible. It is tolerated in the Old Testament, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But if you take another person and sell them into slavery, you risk your life. The punishment, again, is death. Chapter 21, verses 26 and 27. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let them go free for the eye's sake. If he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let them go free for the tooth's sake. So in other words, you knock out a tooth or you knock out an eye of your slave, they go free. Lastly, this is chapter 21, verse 20. If a man beats his male or female servant with a rod and he dies under his hand, the man shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, the Lord shall not be punished, for the slave is his property. So here again, there's a certain boundary put on what masters can do. If you beat your slave and the slave dies immediately, then you're in trouble for this. On the other hand, if the person lives a few days, then you do not get punished. And all of these, as compassionate or as relatively harsh to us as they may seem, all of them are oriented to protect the slave. That if a slave loses his eye, he goes free. If he loses his tooth, he goes free. They can only be beaten to a particular extent. So all of these things actually act to restrain what masters may do. And people may not kidnap and sell others into slavery. And slavery only lasts 6 years. On the 7th year, if you're a Hebrew, you go free. So there's all these protections that are put on the slave and restrictions that are put on the master. So why is it that the Bible allows, that God allows slavery and then puts all these restrictions on it? And what exactly is going on here? And the answer, again, has to do with what is holy. Now, this is not a modern book, so freedom is not what is holy in the Old Testament. Rest is what is holy in the Old Testament. Slavery can therefore be tolerated because there is no contradiction in the idea of arrested slave. Just because you have a slave does not mean that they're being ruthlessly oppressed or tyrannized by violence, not in the view of the Old Testament. On the other hand, and it's very important to remember this, on the other hand, the slave is on the lowest rung of the society, and so therefore the slave is the most vulnerable to oppression, the most vulnerable to abuse and exploitation and tyranny by violence. And because the slave is the most vulnerable, therefore the slave is to be protected and the master is to be restrained. And so what is happening here is a toleration of slavery because the slave can rest, but also a series of restrictions placed around what masters can do to their slaves to protect the ability of the slave to have rest, to have what is holy. And we'll remember at this point that when we saw the fourth commandment, when we read it, your male slave and your female slave, or your male servant and your female servant, they are mentioned. And so the idea is that everyone is to have rest, everyone is to have what is holy, and the slave in particular is not to be oppressed or mistreated or exploited, but to be treated with gentleness. It's worth adding as well that slavery seems to be, as much as possible, I think, in these texts, a matter of the will of the person. That if the person decides to sell themselves into slavery, then according to the Old Testament, they may do so. But there is no forcing another Israelite into slavery. That is not to happen. And so that I think is where the Old Testament is coming from when it comes to slavery. And we see various examples of that in these particular commandments. Now, let's move on a little bit to the attitude towards the poor and oppressed. Here we're going to look in chapter 22, starting with verse 19. He who sacrifices to any god except to the Lord alone, he shall be put to death. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children orphans. If you lend money to any poor brother among you, you shall not be hard on him or charge him interest. If you take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, his only garment for covering his nakedness. What will he sleep in? So it will be when he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am merciful." End quote. Now, I started that passage with, "He who sacrifices to any god except the Lord alone, he shall be put to death." The idea there is rest in God only, worship God only. And this serves as a kind of prelude in this particular passage for a series of commandments that tell the reader, tell the listener, to love their neighbor, particularly to love those who are the most vulnerable. You shall not mistreat the stranger. You shall not afflict the widow or orphan. You shall not mistreat your poor neighbor. You shall not take their garment and pledge and keep it overnight. In other words, you shall love your neighbor, especially the most vulnerable of those neighbors. So we see echoes here of what we saw earlier in the Ten Commandments. Lastly, the Sabbath year. This is chapter 23, verse 10. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. Here, what I want to drive home is that on the 7th year, the land rests. So when we think about the principle of rest as applying to God's creation, it applies to the whole of the creation. It applies to the people, whatever position they may have socially. It applies to the animals. It applies also to the land. So the idea is that everything shall rest. Everything shall participate in what is holy. Everything shall have this great thing that God has given, a release from one's burdens and an ability to step away from those things that are hard and heavy. Now, after the end of the Book of the Covenant, it is affirmed by the people. So getting back to the story a little bit here, Moses came and told the people all the words of God and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words the Lord spoke, we will do. This is chapter 24. Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all the Lord said we will do and be obedient. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant the Lord made with you, according to all these words. End quote. Now, this is the end of the episode or the lecture for today with this book of the covenant being ratified. But we're going to see very quickly that the Israelites are going to step away from it when we discuss the golden calf, which will be in the next lecture. I'll see you all then.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.